Years ago, I committed myself to a psychiatric ward. It wasn't for anything too serious though. I was having some issues with depression, and I was also having a tough time sleeping. If you've never been in a psych ward before, you may not know what it's actually like. They're of course not exactly like what you'd see in the movies. The one I was in was a really clean and well-kept place. The people working there were all super nice as well. I had a nice bed and a room all to myself, and it even had its own private bathroom. The worst thing about being in the psych ward, however, was the complete boredom. Everything is completely organized. You even have a distinct bedtime too. I know that sort of thing is supposed to be good for people with insomnia problems, but it made it even more difficult for me. I'm very much a night person. I like sleeping in and staying up late. But at 10 p.m., all the patients had to take their medication and go to bed on the dot. Even though they gave me sleeping pills as well, it was pretty aggravating because I couldn't fall asleep so early no matter what I tried. The first few nights were pretty terrible. The medication they gave me was zolpidem. It didn't really help me go to sleep though, and if you know much about this medication, it can also make you hallucinate if you don't fall asleep. I was quite aware of this, but I was having so much trouble with not sleeping that I was willing to risk this. On the third or fourth night that I was there, about an hour after I'd taken the medication, I was still tossing and turning in bed. I turned over and opened my eyes. When I glanced over at my bathroom door, I saw the door slowly begin to open from the inside. It didn't open very much, but it was just enough for me to see most of a face hidden behind the crack in that door. I couldn't make the face out very well, but I could tell it was not anyone I had ever seen before. The person didn't seem to acknowledge me in any way either. I froze at first. My brain was still pretty foggy, but I had enough wherewithal to know that I was likely hallucinating. Rather than freak out and call for someone to help me, I tried to close my eyes and go to sleep anyway. As I laid there though, I couldn't help but think about that face in the crack of the door. It made it even more difficult for me to fall asleep, but I truly believed it was only a hallucination. I kept my eyes tightly closed. I figured that feeling would go away, and eventually I'd just fall asleep on my own. After a while though, I realized that something was keeping me from falling asleep. I rolled over on my back and opened my eyes. A sudden shock reverberated throughout my body. The person who'd been in the bathroom was now standing right over me, grinning down at me. I jumped up from being so startled. The person reached down and slapped their hand over my mouth to keep me from screaming. It was right then, when I felt their touch, that I realized this was a real person and not a hallucination. I had only been in the ward less than a week. I figured I must not have known everyone who was there yet. I struggled, but the man was so strong. He held me down firmly, his hand covering my mouth and nose. All I could think to do as this guy began to smother me was to flail around recklessly. I luckily smacked the lamp on the nightstand and knocked it over onto the floor. The loud crashing startled the man, but he still kept his hand firmly over my mouth and nose. Fortunately though, the crash had attracted the people at the night desk. They rushed into the room and pulled the man off even as he continued to try and smother me. The man just kept staring at me, this time with a stern look on his face as they held him down. While I stood there still in shock, an intern rushed in and sedated the man. I later found out why I'd never seen that particular patient before. He had been spending time isolated for severe behavioral issues. Apparently, he'd just been let out that very same day. I have no doubt he was put back in soon after. I got discharged the very next day. There was no way, with his issues needing to be addressed still, that I could spend another single day there. This story absolutely needs to be kept anonymous. I can't even tell you which state I live in, because even telling this story could get me in some serious trouble. I'm a psychiatrist who works in the psychiatric wing of a hospital. It can definitely be a trying job sometimes, but I really like to think that I can and do help people. Although it can be very draining, improving people's mental health is very rewarding. I'm not sure if you're familiar with United States HIPAA privacy laws, but they're extremely protective of an individual's right to privacy. This is especially so in the case of therapy. If someone were to admit something to a therapist, and they were specifically seeking out therapy for this problem, psychiatrists and psychologists are forbidden from relaying this information to the police, at least if there's not clear indication of future crimes. This has, in times, presented me with some pretty terrible admissions that I had to keep secret. The worst one was about 10 years ago. A new patient was admitted into the wing. He was in his late teens or so, thin, sallow, and very depressed looking. His mother had found him in his bedroom, cutting large slashes into his body with a straight razor. She had taken him to the hospital where the wounds were treated, and since he was found to be a danger to himself, they admitted him into my care. I'll call him Kyle, although that's definitely not his real name. I've dealt with a lot of people who've had some pretty severe psychological issues. Kyle, though, was a bit different. If I had to diagnose him, he was likely suffering from an extremely severe conduct personality disorder. Think the kind of teenager who kills small animals, for example. Very often, conduct disorder in a teenager will manifest itself into antisocial personality disorder as an adult. The technical term for this is what you'd call psychopathy. Anyway, Kyle didn't really cause many problems in the ward, although he didn't talk much at all either. This was unusual, because generally conversation was the most common activity amongst all patients. Instead, he would always just ignore everyone and sit and stare at the TV, regardless of what was on, or if it was on at all. When the TV time was over, he would go into his room, lay on his bed, and just stare at the ceiling. Kyle had been in the psychiatric wing for about 2 weeks. When I was talking to him about why he was cutting himself, the subject had come up several times before, he always avoided it. I, of course, needed to know what was going on, though, so I brought it up in every therapy session we had together. So the two of us were talking one day, and I really didn't expect to get any further with him than I ever had before. This time, though, when I asked Kyle why he'd been cutting himself, he suddenly and very quickly responded, "Because I wanted to see the way she felt when I cut her up in the same way." I was shocked. I asked him to elaborate. "If my mom hadn't stopped me, I would have known what she felt like when she bled to death." I asked Kyle what he was talking about. He didn't offer me any new information at all. He just repeated he had slashed some girl in the same way, and that she had painfully bled to death. He wanted to know how it felt himself. I couldn't tell if he was serious or not. I did some research, of course, and there didn't seem to be any recent murders or missing girls in the area. As far as I could figure, Kyle must have been lying. On the other hand, I couldn't discount the fact that he may have been admitting to a real murder. You see, Kyle was well aware that admitting to a crime, including murder, when seeking therapy in relation to that crime, prevents a doctor from contacting the authorities. I had no choice but to keep his secret, which may have been why he was so forthcoming with this story and told me that. The first thing that went through my mind was that if this kid really killed someone, he and I would be the only two people to ever know. In actuality, I can't really tell if he was making the story up. Maybe he was. He probably got annoyed at me that I kept asking him why he was cutting himself. He was that sort of kid. He was dark for the sake of being dark. But there was something about him that wouldn't stop me from being scared to death of this kid. Thankfully, it allowed me to keep him longer in the psychiatric ward for as long as I deemed necessary to protect others from him. I never could find out if he really murdered anyone, and he never mentioned it again. But I kept him under strict observation for a very long time. Easily the most frightening experience I ever had was back when I was in the 5th grade. I remember everything about it actually. I was walking to school, and it was unusually dark outside. The sky was completely overcast, with the darkest clouds I'd ever seen in my life. I did have my umbrella with me just in case it was going to rain, but I made it to school before that happened. I have to admit to being very distracted that day. I spent most of my time looking out the window. The teacher had to call my name several times to get my attention, on more than one occasion as well. I couldn't help it though. There was something very different about the way the approaching storm seemed to me. There was something about it I'd never really noticed in any other storm. I just wasn't really sure what that was. It began to rain quite fiercely about a half hour before lunch. The dark sky was lit up several times by strikes of lightning, and cracks of thunder drowned out my teacher's voice. I was quite mesmerized by what was happening. I'll always remember this part quite vividly. The bell that signified it was time for lunch sounded out. My teacher got up and told us to line up at the door. No sooner than I had gotten up from my desk though, I heard the drill alarm begin to go off. Or at least what I thought was the drill alarm. Immediately, all the kids in line began to panic. I think we all assumed there was a fire. But I guess in hindsight that didn't make much sense, since the rain was falling so hard. The principal's voice suddenly came over the intercom. He informed us that this was not a drill, and it was not a fire either. A tornado warning had just been sounded. We were instructed to go out into the hallway, just as we'd always done when we had tornado drills. Unfortunately, the words of the principal didn't do anything to calm anyone down. Kids were pushing each other out of the way. Everyone was in a hurry to be the first out of the room and into the hallway. It was pretty bad. The teacher was trying desperately to get everyone to calm down. It wouldn't work, and from the sounds of what was happening, it was not working in any of the other classrooms either. I remember I tried pushing through the other kids as well. When I finally got out into the hallway, it was utter chaos. Kids were scrambling around, some were up against the wall in their tornado drill stands, sitting down, putting their head down in their lap and putting their arms over their heads. But unlike the drills, it was not orderly at all. Kids were taking up more space than they needed to. There wasn't enough room for everyone. I didn't want to create a problem myself, so I found a spot on the wall, dug in, and put my head down. I'm not sure how long I sat there like that before it happened. It was loud. Kids were scrambling. The damn tornado alarm was still going off. And then a new sound joined them. It was a surreal, very loud sound, almost like being right in front of a train. I was on the verge of tears because I knew this was the tornado I had been hearing. Well, the sound only got louder and louder. I had this overpowering urge to look up and see. I knew I wasn't supposed to. I was trying to follow the rules, but it was just too loud to resist. Finally, I lifted my head to look up. Right when I did, I heard the most horrible crashing sound. I can't even begin to describe it. I watched as the side of the school was torn right open before my very eyes. I couldn't see a funnel or anything, but I knew the tornado was slamming into the school just down the hallway in front of me. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. For some reason, it crossed my mind that if I simply put my head back down and covered up, it would all be alright. I mean, if the adults tell you this is the way to protect yourself, what else can you do? So that's what I did. It was horrible, listening to the sounds of the tornado, hearing children screaming in despair, and hearing the school being torn apart. Throughout all of it, I tried my best to keep my head down and keep myself locked in place. I don't know how long that lasted, but it seemed like forever. Eventually, the noise died down. The tornado was gone. I waited, still scared, until a teacher tapped me on my shoulder and told me it was okay to get up. The area where the tornado had hit the school had been absolutely obliterated. If you've never been in a tornado before, I know a lot of people have said they really want to see one, but really, I don't think you do. I had been planning on going on a fishing trip for quite a while. When I got up in the morning, I had everything packed and put into my truck. My boat was secured, and I set out before the sun had even come up. Although I'd checked the weather before I went to bed, and even when I got up, I was a bit surprised when the sun did rise. It was supposed to be overcast and rainy, and it certainly was that day. But what surprised me was just how dark the clouds overhead were. I tried not to let it get me down though. When you really want to go fishing, rain is one of the last things that will stop you from doing so. I went out on the lake in my boat, and the sky was still pretty dark. I had gotten to the lake and out on my boat before the rain started falling. However, when it did begin to finally fall, it was raining hard. I remember getting slapped by the drops of rain and feeling like the rain was actually physically attacking me. I found the sensation very unpleasant, but it wasn't enough to get me to come off the water. When the sky was positively lit up by the scariest lightning I'd ever seen in my life though, I decided it might be best to put my fishing trip to an abrupt end. I started the motor and started to head for land. The lake was not very big, so it wouldn't take me very long to get to shore. Getting my boat out of the water in that weather, though, was not going to be fun. Suddenly, though, something caught my attention. I began to hear the strangest sound I'd ever heard. It sounded like a loud and wet crash. That might not be the best way to describe it, but it's the only way I can think of at the moment. I turned around and was absolutely shocked at what I saw in the distance. A small, thin tornado had just touched down right on the surface of the lake. I began to panic. I mean, anybody would. You like to think you'll be calm and act rationally when these things happen, but no, I definitely could not. Hell, I almost wanted to jump out of my boat and swim to shore. Of course, that would have been absolutely stupid. My boat was way faster than I was, but something in my head was just telling me that was logical. Instead of following that thought though, I kept on heading for shore. I couldn't take my eyes off this sudden waterspout. Every time I looked forward, it was only for a second before I looked back. And yeah, I could see this waterspout was heading right in my direction. As I said, it was not a big lake, so the spout didn't have a lot of places to go. When I'd finally reached the shore, the tornado had made some serious ground on me. I couldn't risk trying to dock my boat. I was just close enough where I could jump out of it and on to the dock. I began to run as fast as I could to my truck and jumped inside. Just as I'd started it up, I saw the scariest thing I'd ever seen. The waterspout rushed over and picked my boat up out of the water as if it were a feather. The boat was thrown through the air before it came crashing down only a few yards away from my truck. I shot the truck into gear and took off. Fortunately, I was able to get away in the end, but that was certainly very scary. I have a recurring dream. Well, it's more of a recurring concept dream, and the dream itself is not the same, but what happens in it always is. I'll be somewhere with any person, usually a different person each time. It will be really cloudy outside. I'll look off into the distance and see a tornado touch down. I'll panic, and this is the funny part. Each time I see the tornado, I'll remember that I'm having a recurring dream about tornadoes. I'll tell myself this time is not a dream. I run off and try to find a basement to hide in. I've been having this dream over and over for my whole life. What makes this story so weird is that it happened in December. It was December 21st, 2013 to be precise. I was moving into a house with my sister as my roommate. It took place in Tennessee on the very day of the move. We were pretty upset that it was supposed to be a rainy day, so we tried to get all of our loading done before it began to rain. We were actually pretty fortunate that we were able to get everything done with no more than a sprinkling hitting us. We were only about an hour and 20 minutes away from the place we were moving to, so it was supposed to be a pretty quick job. It was unusually warm that day, so far it was not a really unpleasant experience. Probably about 5 o'clock in the evening though, we were in our house with our pets. My sister has 4 cats, a dog, and I had a ferret. We were sorting through things when my phone began to make a noise I was unfamiliar with. I picked it up, and when I looked down, I was shocked to see a tornado warning. I was not too concerned, however. Although I've never had one on my phone before, I've had tornado warnings happen. I've never actually seen a tornado myself. I guess the reason it shocked me so much was that it was odd to get a tornado in December. We went ahead and gathered the pets into the living room with us. We had a basement, but you had to go outside and around to the backyard to get into it. I had the key ready just in case I had to do this. It then began raining really hard, and I mean really hard. My cell phone made another urgent warning again. It told us to immediately take shelter. There were several loud cracks of thunder, and then the weirdest thing happened. Almost immediately, the rain stopped altogether. There was no more thunder, and it was eerily quiet. I was familiar with that calm before the storm thing in regards to tornadoes, but when it actually happened, it was so strange and unnerving. We were about to gather the pets up and rush down to the basement when the silence was broken by an immediate deafening crash. Then there was a sound I can only describe as a train on steroids. It was very loud, and the thunder began to clap again. We decided we could not go outside to the basement at this point. We were concerned the tornado was now too close. The electricity went out altogether, and just when we thought it couldn't get any worse, the entire house began to shake in place. The pets were all scared, and we didn't know what to do. I went over to look out the window, scared, but still curious to see if there really was a tornado out there. I didn't see it. I couldn't really see anything. It was too dark, and the electricity was out everywhere. I sat in the house with the pets. The noise got louder and louder, and the house began to shake even more fiercely. I was pretty terrified. I began to wonder if we really should have gone into the basement. It was then that very suddenly the noise stopped. The house stopped shaking almost instantly. The lights came back on. It was over just as quickly as it had begun. The whole experience was so surreal. The next morning, I didn't see any other houses that were damaged. There were trees knocked over in the street, but that was the only sign that anything had ever happened. I don't know. I tell you, it was strange that the very day we moved into that house, it had to be hit by a tornado. Just really, really bad luck.